Good morning, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Brenda Carter, and I am the state representative for Michigan. I'm also the vice chair of the NCOIL Joint State Federal Relations and International Insurance Issues Committee. I am going to moderate this general session. We have a great panel of speakers with us here today to discuss a very timely and important topic: public policy issues surrounding requiring liability insurance for gun owners. For many years, states have discussed implementing that type of policy, but activity has really increased in the past few years. Here in California, the city of San Jose recently enacted a first-of-a-kind ordinance requiring gun owners to have liability insurance, and similar policy has been introduced at the state level in California Senate. New Jersey has also enacted similar legislation, and bills have been introduced in other states as well. I also sponsored a related bill last year in my home state of Michigan, and I remain interested in pursuing the issue both there and here at NCOIL. A copy of my Michigan bill has been distributed, and some of the other laws and bills I just mentioned are in your binder starting on page 210 and are on the website and the app. Before we get started, I'd like to make a couple of points similar to what Assemblywoman Hunter stated yesterday during the ESG session. It is critical for all of us to be respectful of different perspectives we'll hear during this session. We all owe it to NCOIL and to our constituents to remain decorum during this session. I don't want to take up too much more of our time from our panel because I want to ensure there's enough time for Q&A. So joining us today to discuss these issues are Rob Hoyt, Chair and Professor of Risk Management and Insurance at the University of Georgia; Deborah Ramirez, Professor of Law and Co-Director of the Center of Law, Equity, and Race at Northeastern University School of Law. Heck, with these two distinguished professors on this panel, Will and Tom should give us double continuing education credits. Ray Lehman, Editor-in-Chief and Senior Fellow at the International Center of Law and Economics, and California State Senator Catherine Blakespear, who is a sponsor of the California legislation I just mentioned. I urge you all to read their bios, which are in the conference program and on the app, and to reach out to them afterwards to learn more about them and about these important issues. And now we will begin with our panelists. First, Rob Hoyt.
Okay, thank you very much, Representative Carter, and I owe you credit for your attendance yesterday, too, at my luncheon session. So thank you for having me here today. I'll just open by mentioning that I think we all share a similar concern around the increases in gun-related deaths and injuries. So there's certainly plenty of room for concern around that. But what I was asked to do briefly with you to tee things off for our discussion is to briefly review some relevant insurance concepts and principles, many of which have actually developed over hundreds of years within the industry that I at least think are useful to you to be aware of as you contemplate and consider various proposals of this type. So let me mention a few of those, again, being brief at this stage. Insurance contracts cover fortuitous and accidental losses. I mean, that's really at the core of insurance principles. What that translates into when you start to look at liability insurance is that it generally excludes coverage for intentional acts And as an example of that, typical language in a homeowner's policy would say something to the effect that they exclude liability for expected or intended injury. So that's a fairly common provision within liability policies generally, but certainly in the personal line sector and homeowners. This serves to mitigate another very important concept in the business of insurance, which is the notion of moral hazard. So the idea that intentional acts by an individual could either increase the severity or the frequency of potential losses. So that concept is really embedded in insurance. In fact, historically, I could buy a life insurance policy on you, even though I don't have an insurable interest, okay? But it didn't take long in England when these provisions were in place for people to realize that all of a sudden I might have an incentive to try to speed up the mortality curve a little bit. So the notion of the requirement that I have an insurable interest in the life of someone that I would insure is a good example of what has developed in insurance to try to mitigate that issue of moral hazard. Okay? Of concern as we think about liability when applied to gun liability is that sadly over 97%, these are CDC statistics, of gun deaths are intentional. Sadly, suicides and homicides being the lion's share of that particular 97%. Another important concept to be aware of is the notion of third-party liability. We talk about liability contracts as being contracts of third-party liability. What that translates into is frequently in homeowners, again, as an example, is that liability insurance generally excludes coverage for injuries to other members of the household. Okay? In a similar way, in the commercial context, often workers' comp would be an exclusive remedy for employees in the workplace context. So third-party liability, again, important to be reminded of that. Somewhat tied to some things that were mentioned in the session this morning, insurance is priced based on frequency and severity of losses. The underwriting process obviously focuses on exposures that impact these, and insurers respond to claims and or anticipated changes in future claims around exposures to loss. So they're obviously at the core of the business of insurance. Insurance does provide incentives to mitigate exposure that impact, and I'll put in quotes, covered losses. So that's an important point too, and that was brought up in some discussion in the earlier session this morning, is that absolutely, in fact, I teach in my classes that an important tenet of the insurance business is that we provide people with financial incentives to take appropriate mitigative activities, okay? But that only is incented in the context of losses that would be covered. And so a quick example, lower premium for property insurance if we have a security system, because obviously that impacts on the potential for loss due to theft. So as you think about the discussions here today, but certainly as you consider proposed liability issues or gun liability related proposals in your various jurisdictions, two tracks seem to have surfaced with regards to where some of those proposals arise, either on the gun ownership at the personal lines. In the insurance context, this would be in the personal lines marketplace in many cases where liability is imposed on the gun owner, or in the commercial insurance sector, which would frequently be targeted more at proposals around liability by gun sellers, manufacturers, distributors, individuals of that sort, okay, or businesses. So on the personal line side, homeowners and renters insurance by and large, currently would respond. So generally covers liability for gun use, but to my earlier point, very important here in this context, for unintended acts, right? So unintentional injury, at least in the framework that I'd mentioned before. Do most people have this coverage? Well, the statistics, and this can vary by jurisdiction, but the statistics show that about 90% of homeowners do have some form of homeowners insurance, so relatively high insurance rates in that marketplace. So people, most of us, would currently have coverage under our homeowners policy for those things. Coverage for renters insurance, although the provisions would be similar, coverage for renters insurance is not nearly as universally held. So again, variation by market and by location, but estimates are that maybe less than 40% of renters would actually have renters insurance in place as you think about kind of the existing marketplace. On the commercial insurance side, coverage is heavily, at least to the best of my research, heavily in the so-called excess and surplus lines market. So the non-admitted market, not the primary, the admitted insurance market, or in specialty markets. So it's not as clear-cut as to where coverage may be available for some of those organizations. Again, it exists, but just in a more specialized context. There's no apparent, and I did do some inquiries here, but there's no apparent move by insurers to alter policies or underwriting requirements currently with regards to gun ownership. As many of you are probably well aware, this is not a common, if in fact at all, a question that's is raised when we apply for a homeowner's or renter's insurance policy. Insurers generally are not collecting that kind of information. The one exception would be on the property side, where there's usually an internal limit that limits how much you are covered for theft of guns, and you can adjust that in most policies, but you'd have to disclose more details about the property that would be scheduled and covered. So, but on the liability side, there's really not much evidence, at least at this current stage, that is a question that's raised. Expansion of liability standards, however, may have an impact, and they certainly could have an impact on availability. So that's something to just be aware of as you review and look at different proposals. I will note that there's also evidence, pretty strong evidence, that the rates of coverage, so I mentioned overall numbers, rates of coverage do vary by income level. So the percentage of people that would have coverage for homeowners or renters insurance would be lower in most cases for lower income and economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, and obviously that brings another set of concerns beyond just the discussion here today. Both the previous point about an expansion of liability limits may be impacting on the insurance market and changing insurers' behavior, even though nothing has occurred there as of yet, apologies. Both that point and the lower insurance rates in some communities could raise an interesting question here in the context of the Second Amendment protections around ownership rights to firearms. So that's at least something to be aware of, and probably will be explored further in comments here today. So finally, I thank you. Perfect timing, okay? Yes. I hope that some of these reminders about core insurance concepts and principles will be helpful as you discuss and consider proposed legislative action around gun liability and insurance. I look forward to responding to any questions that you may have when we get to that point. Thank you again.
Thank you, Professor Hoyt. We're going to hold all questions to the end when all our panelists have an opportunity to speak. Next, we'll hear from Professor Deborah Ramirez.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, especially in person. Thank you, Representative Carter, for presiding over this important panel. It's an honor to be here. Today, I'm going to be discussing mandatory gun liability insurance for both gun owners and gun dealers. Next slide. In this presentation, I am trying to solve two problems. So is this the clicker? Thank you. Thank you. I'm trying to solve two problems. Problem one is that we do not currently have in this country an effective firearm screening system to prevent those who are a danger to themselves or others from obtaining firearms. And the second problem that I'm trying to deal with is there's no current system to compensate the victims of gun violence. I am contemplating or proposing to you that we create a new kind of gun liability insurance that does not exist now, something that I call a victim compensation and fund model. Now, the solution to these two problems is this. It is to mandate gun victim compensation insurance, to require insurance companies or third-party contractors to do a complete and real risk assessment, screen potential gun owners for dangerousness, and use premiums and fees for a victim compensation fund. Now, as I said earlier, this solution is a new product, a new model requiring gun owners and gun dealers to purchase victim compensation insurance. Next slide. Highland Park. Now, Highland Park is a very interesting case study that illuminates the problems that I've just identified. How many of you remember Highland Park? It was Illinois. It was 2022. It was July 4th. Hands up, anyone remember this? I remember it for a particular reason. My brother and his 4 kids live in Highland Park, Illinois. And so on the 4th of July, when I heard about this, there were hours when I did not know where they were or what had happened to them. And it made me think hard about what we're doing in this country to prevent this from happening to other people. So the first thing I wanted to know was a little bit about the shooter, Robert Crimo. He used a legally acquired gun. He shot, 7 people were killed, 48 were wounded. And I asked myself, what did we know about Crimo before he shot? Well, we knew that prior to the shooting, he had a public online presence with disturbing, violent images. We knew some other things. Next slide. April 2019, the Highland Park police went to his house because he attempted suicide. We knew that in September of 2019, he threatened to kill everyone in the household, and the Highland Park police returned. They confiscated 18 knives out of that house, and they issued a clear and present danger report, saying Crimo admitted to them to having a history of drug use and to being depressed when his statements were made. This is the state of the record, right, in 2019. In 2020, the Illinois State Police gave him a firearm ID card, and he passed 4 background checks, including the Federal National Instant Criminal Background Check System. So I asked myself the next question. How many of these mass shootings could have been prevented if there had been a real system of looking at dangerousness? Were there red flags in these other instances? So I had my research assistants, including Claire, who's here, work on this. And I found out that in many of these cases, there were prior red flags. Red flags including mental health concerns, substance use disorder, prior encounters with the police, and fascination with violence and death. And I learned something else, that between 1966 and 2019, 77% of the mass shooters obtained the weapons they used through legal purchases. 77% got those guns legally. So given that problem, here is a possible solution. I agree with everyone who's going to speak that this doesn't exist right now and that we would have to create it. But that doesn't mean that we can't. Here's the idea. We mandate gun victim compensation insurance for gun owners and gun dealers. Insurance companies do a thorough background check to assess for dangerousness, a real one, looking at the reports. The higher the risk, the higher the premiums. The premiums go into a victim compensation fund to cover willful, accidental, negligent, and reckless injuries. And the payouts only go to the victims, not to the gun owners, not to the gun dealers, not to their families, not to their relatives. It only goes to the victims. And you can cap victim compensation at $100K per person. What would the screening process look like? What should it look like in this country before we hand someone a gun? Periodic mental health assessments. Is there a gun safe and trigger locks? Have they completed a gun safety training course? Are there children in the home? What are the number and type of firearms we're talking about insuring? Is there prior violent behavior, prior threats of violent behavior, previous gun-related issues, police reports, including driving under the influence, and domestic violence? Is there a public online presence that's disturbing? All right, how would it work? So in order to get a gun permit, you need to present proof of insurance. Insurance companies conduct the background check before agreeing to provide the individuals with insurance. Premiums are determined on risk of dangerousness to self and others. This would cover both commercial and private sales, and there would be a small fine for failure to procure insurance, analogous to driving without it in the auto context. Insurance coverage. In an ideal world, and I get it, it's a world that doesn't exist this second, insurance would cover intentional acts of gun violence to compensate the victims of mass shootings and other things. Not suicides, but other things. None of the payouts would go to the gun owners or gun dealers, and the gun owners and dealers would be liable for the first $50K, so they'd have some skin in the game. Payouts are only to unrelated individuals and individuals previously unknown to the gun owner and gun dealer. Now I'm going to stop here because currently we know that insurance companies don't do this. We're going to be told that we don't do this, they don't have this kind of liability insurance. I am proposing something not that radical, that gun owners and gun dealers become collectively responsible for gun victim injuries and deaths by mandating that they're part of this victim compensation insurance before they get a gun. We are proposing a new product that does not exist. And the victim compensation fund can be created in 3 ways. 1, insurance companies could decide to do this, collect the premiums, cover the payouts. 2, and now I'm speaking to the legislators in the room, this could be done by the government without the insurance companies. Municipalities, state, or federal governments could create a victim compensation policy and fund. They've done it in the past. Examples are medical malpractice and patient compensation funds. Or option 3, speaking to everyone in the room, this could be a hybrid. Insurance companies could actually work with the government to create a compensation fund and share responsibilities and coverage, including reinsurance or shared risk pool responsibilities. Now, gun insurance is somewhat like car insurance. All 50 states require it. We have to have it to drive. We get a background check. If we keep driving dangerously, we're priced out of driving by increased premiums. Feasibility. As we said, there is gun insurance already in homeowners and renters, but it's an insurance that covers only accidental third-party shootings, which are rare, and so it's not very helpful in its current and extant form. Okay, what are the challenges? So one was already mentioned, moral hazard. Insurance companies don't want to insure intentional acts of violence, because they do not want to incentivize bad actors to do bad things. But this model, payouts only go to the victims. They do not go to the bad actor, to the bad actor's relatives, to the bad actor's family. In fact, the bad actor has to pay the first $50K, not $300K. So we're not incentivizing bad actors to do bad acts. The second main concern is Second Amendment. How many of you have heard about the Second Amendment case involving New York's open carry laws? Anyone? Yes? That's the Bruin opinion. After Bruin, there is one and only one case that has decided whether mandatory insurance violates the Second Amendment. That is Judge Freeman's opinion, which is on the slide. She decided the insurance mandate in San Jose did not violate the Second Amendment because there's a historic analog, 18th century surety law, who knew, and because jurisprudence historically held gun owners liable for injuries caused by guns. Now, she emphasized this is an analog, it's not a twin, but the court said you only had to have an analog, not a twin. Now, looking at this, she says history supports this and it's not unconstitutional. Same history looked at by Adam Schneiderman in Michigan Law Review says exactly the opposite. He says the analog is 18th century surety law. If you want to, the article goes through it if you're interested in 18th century surety law. But mostly he says it's not the appropriate historical analog because the justices of the peace in the 18th century had to first adjudicate the person as dangerousness before the surety was required. Okay, so you have two different versions of history, but there are additional considerations. I think the most important thing is that first sentence written by Justice Alito in his concurrence. He said, our holding decides nothing about who may lawfully possess a firearm or the requirements that you need to buy a gun. What he is saying is, what we decided in this case is once you lawfully possess a gun, you should be able to open carry it, and if you do certain things. And they said the test in New York is discretionary. It's a may carry law, and you had to prove proper cause, and that once you were legally possessing a gun, you couldn't burden legally possessors of gun with this discretionary proper cause test. Remember that at the same time they were adjudicating the constitutionality of shall issue states, those states that allowed legitimate gun owners who already lawfully possessed a gun to carry open if they were fingerprinted, background checks, gun safety certificates. Those were all held constitutional because if you did those things, your open carry license shall issue, it was not discretionary.
Dr. Ramirez, we have about 2 minutes.
Okay. Gun dealers have no Second Amendment rights, and so I think it would pass constitutional muster. My final comment is this. The situation we are in is like the idea of electric car in 1960. Everyone knew it was a good idea, but they said it couldn't happen, even though it would help with global warming and our dependence on oil. There were two challenges. We needed a battery much more powerful than had ever been invented or anyone had ever seen, and we needed to develop an electric car charging infrastructure that we didn't have. The big car companies said, can't do it, will never happen, not what we see, not what we do. But Elon Musk and Tesla did it. They invented the battery, and with billions of dollars in subsidies from federal, state, and local government, created the electric car charging infrastructure. Lessons. Big car companies weren't the innovators. It was a private-public effort. We need this product, and this product can be built. The good news is you, the legislators in the room, can build it. But I have a message for you. Big insurance is not going to build this for you. You are going to have to build it, and you have the capacity to do that. The question is, do you have the will? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ramirez. And now we'll hear from Ray Lehman.
Thank you, Representative Carter. Thank you to members of NCOIL for inviting me. My name is Ray Lehman. I'm the Editor-in-Chief and Senior Fellow with the International Center for Law and Economics. ICLE is a think tank based in Portland, Oregon. We are dedicated to promoting the law and economics tradition and approach to legal analysis and to issues of public policy more generally. Some of you may know me from my prior work at the R Street Institute, which I co-founded in 2012. I ran the Institute's insurance project and was the author of its first 9 editions of its annual regulation report card, looking at insurance regulation in the 50 states. It was actually early in our days at R Street that I first encountered the topic before us today. After the tragic shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary, December 2012, there was a pressing call for new and creative ways to address the scourge of firearms violence, being that we were a research center overwhelmingly dedicated to insurance issues in public policy. We explored whether mandatory insurance could be part of the solution to promote firearm safety, just as mandatory auto insurance has served to promote driving safety and mandatory workers' comp has served to promote workplace safety. So while I'm about to tell you why I think these mandates are a bad idea, I do want to note at the top that I understand the intuition. What we concluded after batting around various iterations of what a mandate might look like was that it was fundamentally unworkable, that insurance could not possibly respond to the overwhelming number of cases that were of public concern, and that the limited set where it could respond, which is basically true accidents that befall third parties, coverage either already exists, either through a homeowner's policy or a renter's policy. The 2 central problems that limit the applicability of any firearms insurance mandates are that that intentional acts are uninsurable, and that it is the nature of liability insurance that only third parties are covered. Taking those one at a time, the claim that intentional acts are uninsurable begs 2 other obvious questions, each of which unfortunately can get us down some rather unproductive detours. What does it mean for an act to be intentional? What does it mean for an event to be insurable? On intentionality, there's a whole rabbit hole one can head down on free will and determinism and whether all acts are intentional or whether no acts are intentional. This is not a philosophy class, so I'd like to rescue us from that particular rabbit hole. The question of insurability returns me to a theme I found myself echoing a lot in another recent public policy discussion, which is whether business interruption for pandemics is insurable. What I said then, and will say here, is that insurability is a spectrum. Things may be more or less insurable, meaning in a nutshell that the willingness of capital to participate in risk transfer solutions for any particular class of event will vary. The framing that I think is most helpful for these purposes is to say that the sorts of events that are most insurable are fortuitous, that's to say they happen by chance, not by design, and where there is a broad alignment between the goals of the insurer and the insured. When I step into my car, I would like to avoid getting into an accident. My insurer would also like me to avoid getting into an accident. If I do nonetheless get into an accident, it's a fortuitous event. That event is insurable. If rather than an accident, I willfully run down someone on the road, then we're not aligned. That's not insurable, and claims for vehicular homicide are excluded, even though in some places and in some cases, the insurer may still be required by a judge or a jury to pay a claim. So applying that logic to the example of firearms incidents offers some context for just how many potential claims are excluded simply from the fact that insurers are not willing to extend coverage to intentional acts. According to the CDC, more than 70% of firearms injuries are the result of assaults. Less than 20% are unintentional. Among firearms-related deaths, the National Safety Council finds that 54% are suicides, 43% are homicides, and only about 1% are accidental. So we start with the proposition that only about 1/5 of firearms injuries and only about 1 in 100 firearms deaths are potentially insurable. That universe of claims shrinks even further, although the data on this is harder to find, when you consider that it's the nature of liability policies that they only cover injuries to third parties. If a contractor slips and falls on your property, that might be covered under your homeowner's policy. If you slip and fall, it will not be. If your dog bites your neighbors, it might be covered. If your dog bites you, it will not be covered. So similarly, if there's a firearms accident in your home and a third party is injured, that might be covered. Even, indeed, if the accident is outside your home, say you're the Vice President of the United States and you accidentally shoot your hunting partner in the face, your homeowner's policy might very well cover that. But the insured in a homeowner's policy is the household, not the individual. If one member of your household accidentally shoots another member of your household, even in the very tragic incidents we hear about involving children, that's not going to be an insured claim. Another factor that shrinks the universe of claims even further is the language of the HO3 policy itself. The policy has always excluded injuries or property damage that the insured, quote, expected or intended. But actually in 2000, the ISO broadened that exclusion quite a bit, and the standard policy now states that coverage is excluded for an action that is, quote, of a different kind, quality, or degree than initially expected or intended, or is sustained by a different person, entity, real or personal property than initially expected or intended. So that's a pretty broad exclusion, and courts have tended to read it as covering even negligently careless actions that result in unintentional injuries. So nonetheless, despite these manifest limitations on what an insurance mandate might possibly cover, we have watched these proposals being perennially introduced in various states in the decades since Sandy Hook, with New York and Connecticut being two of the most frequent states where legislation was considered. Until this past year, when the city of San Jose and the state of New Jersey both adopted different versions of a mandate, they had never gone anywhere. But interestingly, in 2018, we saw regulatory action that, rather than mandate liability insurance for gun owners, actually would appear to forbid it. And that contradiction is important and underappreciated in this current discussion. So for a recap, back in 2018, then New York State Financial Services Superintendent Maria Vullo brought complaints against the broker Lockton, the underwriter Chubb, and the National Rifler Association over their respective roles in administering the Carry Guard insurance program for NRA members. Some of the charges concerned alleged violations of the declinations requirement to place policies in the surplus lines market, and that the NRA was acting as an unlicensed producer in marketing policies. And those charges are not of much interest here, but the core charge is, and that was that because Carry Guard would pay legal defense costs for insureds who face civil or criminal charges, that is where they plead innocent, claim self-defense, or that they are not liable in civil proceeding, the claim from New York was that that was fundamentally contrary to public policy, which is that criminal acts cannot be insured. Now, as many insurance lawyers in this room, I'm sure, could testify, it's not always quite as simple as that. It is not unusual for an insurer in, say, the D&O or E&O market or environmental liability lines to find themselves on the hook for the defense costs of an insured who is accused of a criminal act. And where that insured is adjudicated guilty, the insurer may try to claw back those costs. But until that point, there are fiduciary duties that an insurer owes to its policyholders. Refusing to pay defense costs on a liability policy is usually a quick ticket to a bad faith lawsuit.
We have to give you a 2-minute warning as well.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
So anyway, let me skip ahead. Fundamentally, the problem here was New Jersey also followed New York in pursuing the Carry Guard program. New Jersey has now mandated insurance. It appears that it's mandated insurance that it has previously said is illegal. That's a contradiction that's somewhat absurd. And so finally, I just wanted to wrap up. I understand the motivation for these mandates. It is partly to try to seek an end run around the Second Amendment, have the insurance companies perform the function that states and localities are currently barred by Second Amendment jurisprudence from determining who can own a gun and who can't. The problem is insurers, we know that there is coverage, for instance, in homeowners. Insurers are not using rate setting or underwriting to determine who should own guns or at what rates they should pay. That's not how that market works. They charge a flat rate. Even the NRA's Carry Guard program charged a flat rate to its members. So we don't know that there is any data that would support risk differentials among potential insureds here. Without that, you're just relying on a hope that that's the way the actuarial data will shake out. We don't know that that's the case.
Thank you for your testimony. And finally, we will have testimony from California State Senator Catherine Blakeshire.
Well, thank you and good morning. It's great to be here, and I want to thank Representative Carter and NCOIL for inviting me, and also to my panelists, who it's been very interesting to hear from you and the different perspectives. I am a newly elected state senator here in California. I've just been in office now for going on my third month. I come from being the mayor of my city of Encinitas, and I introduced a bill, which is SB 8, which would require that anyone who owns a gun would have an insurance policy. And the reason, I think it's important to just step back a little bit and put gun ownership in this country in context, just as a reminder about how dangerous guns are to us and to basically public health in this country. So firearms are now the #1 leading cause of death for children. So it used to be cars, but cars have gotten safer, and there are now, between the ages of 1 and 19, it's the #1 leading cause of death. There are more guns in circulation than there are people. So we have 466 million firearms in civilian possession. We have about 330 million people in this country. So that's more than 1 million guns more than people in this country. And also 40% of Americans either own a gun or live in a household with someone who owns a gun. So guns are in wide circulation, and they are inherently dangerous, in the same way that cars are. They're in wide circulation, and they are inherently dangerous. So what I'm aiming to do with my bill and this effort is really to reduce gun violence and to save lives. So it's recognizing that this is not an effort to take people's guns away. It's a recognition that guns are out there in wide circulation, so how can we make them safer? And we know that insurance in so many industries has had such a critical role in assessing risk and also redistributing cost. So right now, the cost of gun violence is borne largely by the victims and then society at large. So the costs of gun violence are estimated at, this is from Everytown Research and Policy issued last summer. It has a $557 billion economic cost to the country each year. And what is that cost? Like, what is it exactly what does that come from? I mean, it's costs to local governments, it's insurance, it's medical costs, it's, wait, let me get to that part of my page, because I think it's important to just think about, oh yes, so ambulance and patient transport, medical care, including Medicaid, mental health care, coroner services, rehabilitation, lost wages, immediate medical treatment. So you think about all of the effects, the ripple effects of gun violence in our community, and then recognizing that we have a responsibility to try to do more about that. So my interest in the gun policy is really, or in the gun insurance requirement, is really that it would drive behavior change on the part of gun owners to have insurance companies asking, do you have a gun in the home? Is it safely stored? So all of the perspective that was provided about the percentage, like 97% of gun deaths are intentional, according to Mr. Hoyt, and then the explanation that Mr. Lehman gave about how many of these things wouldn't be covered. That's okay. I'm not intending to have insurance cover all of these different aspects of gun violence. But the reality is that for shootings in schools, those guns, 75% of them are coming from the home. And so the fact that the gun is accessible to the child means that it is not safely stored de facto. So yes, it becomes an intentional shooting. But how can we reduce the amount of school shootings or the amount of these intentional shootings by making it so that insurance companies are asking questions that you're already asking in other industries? So basically, why aren't guns treated as seriously as like pools and trampolines and aggressive dog breeds, things that we are asking as part of homeowner insurance policies, and sometimes that is driving the behavior of people to put up a safety fence around their pool or to take out the diving board on their pool because of the insurance requirements and questions that are coming from having that conversation. So the insurance industry would really drive these types of considerations about whether you are safer to have a gun in the home and what is the risk of something like a school shooting happening, or a gun theft. So the statistics around the number of gun thefts from both cars and homes, it's going up exponentially right now. And in some ways, this isn't a surprise when you think about firearms, because many of them are small, they're concealable, they carry a high value, and so guns are entering our system legally, but then they are being used in these other ways because they are not being safely stored. So the driver of this is the behavior of safe storage for gun owners. So what else do I want to say? I guess that's the point. So, I'm eager to work with all partners. I was listening to the previous presentation here, and NCOIL was talking about model bills. And I guess my ideal would be that the insurance industry would come up with a model bill, that you would think about this from a market perspective. You would say, this is something that we could actually sell, like you sell homeowners insurance and auto insurance and flood and fire and all the different things, because it's a market. And in some ways, it just really begs that question of why aren't we treating it like all of the other risks that we have in our society that do cause injury and death to people. So I would invite NCOIL to consider that, and all of the insurance agents and representatives here to think about that too, because ideally this is a partnership with the insurance industry that's coming up with this product. And thank you very much. It's Catherine Blakespear, and I'm a new state senator.
Congratulations, Senator Blakespear. And now I'll open it up for questions. Any legislators have questions? Representative Coleman.
Thank you. I think this idea of victim compensation and insuring firearms is an interesting one, and I appreciate all your testimony or all your commentary. And the senator made some interesting comments. I just am curious, and you mentioned some studies. Is there any data that exists or that can be shared around these types of laws and how they affect handling and storage and behavior around gun safety? Is there anything else that you can share on that? Or
by these types of laws, you mean mandatory insurance? So the San Jose ordinance has taken effect, and it's, to my knowledge, the only one that has taken effect yet. The New Jersey statute is currently enjoined from taking effect, and there may be there's continuing to be, there's litigation to challenge both. So where that goes is not, really not enough time yet to have performed any studies. San Jose's only took effect January 1st. Yep.
Thank you. Representative Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to the panel for your comments. I thought about wrapping this back with the ESG conversation and asking if we thought maybe the carriers should be allowed to invest their premium funds in fossil fuels, but we can address that on another day. I am curious, and I really am interested in this idea. I think it's a good idea. In car insurance, the policy follows the vehicle. Those of you who are interested in this idea and want to see it come to fruition, would you want to see the policy follow the gun or the gun owner? And I know that in some cases, if the person who purchases the weapon is not the one using it, that alone may be, depending on your jurisdiction, illegal. So I know that there's some gray area here, but to I forgot your name, man, in the blue jacket, but to your point, back in the 60s, we didn't know how this was going to work, and now I ride an electric bike all the time. So I know that some of this is just going to be time, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Thank you. I think, and again, I'm not wedded to any idea, particular aspect of this, but I'd like it to follow the gun owner and the gun dealer. The gun owner is the one who's going to have to get the insurance, pay the premiums, and the same with the gun dealer. And they're going to be liable if the gun that they sell or that they own is used in a shooting. Having said that, the San Jose law says if the gun is stolen and you report the gun stolen, then you're not liable, right? Because that's fair. But this would encourage gun dealers not to sell a gun to anyone unless there'd been a real background check evidenced by an insurance card with this new product. And it would make sure that the background check is on the gun owner to ensure that if the person is dangerous to themselves or to others, they don't get the gun. Now, the background check is critical here. It's a critical piece of the idea, and the question is, where do you get the money from that? Could it be paid by the gun owners and gun dealers, or if you got a private insurance company, which I think that's where you're going to go, a small private insurance company and provide subsidization like Primus is doing in the gun liability for police officers category. You could see whether or not there'd be philanthropies who would help with the cost of this. So you have the Gifford Foundation, you have a lot of philanthropic money, a lot of money in this country going to, is there a solution, what can we do? Maybe they, along with government subsidies, would help to fulfill the screening process.
And if I could just answer your question. So to me, it seems like if you have 10 guns, just like if you have 10 cars, you should pay more money than someone who has one. Yeah. So however that is accomplished, it makes sense to me what you were saying about it following the car, but then the person is the one who's actually going out for the insurance policy. But part of it is there's a cost to having an insurance policy that you're paying on every month. So it needs to, of course, go up if you have a large arsenal.
Thank you. Representative Dunnigan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So is your vision of this insurance optional, mandatory? People buy it if they want, or they're required to buy it if they have a gun?
Well, I envision it in the sense looking at how we manage cars. So you need to have an insurance policy. And so I would see it not as optional. It would need to be mandatory. I mean, that would be the only real way that would work. So, yeah, I guess that answers your question.
Thank you. And then to the gun dealer, so the concept is if I go to a gun dealer, I would not be able to purchase a gun unless I showed insurance ID.
Exactly.
Normally, like when you buy a car and then you get the insurance. So how do you get the insurance before you have the item?
Well, that's part of the process. You know, you have to go through the screening process first, get the insurance card, and present it in order to purchase a gun.
But normally, like, the price of a car is going to depend on the type of the car and how expensive it is. I would think the price would be different on a gun if it's the type of gun. The type of gun might be more hazardous than others. I just think it's just something to think about. It's going to be hard to get insurance on something that you don't own yet. You're going to say, I want insurance on my gun. What gun do you have? I don't have it yet. That's going to be hard to risk or hard to rate. And then have you thought about limits on the policy? You talked about a $50,000 deductible or something like that. What about an upper limit?
An upper limit, I think you'd want to do like, and again, the numbers, that's why it would be helpful for NCOIL to actually run some numbers and see what's feasible. But I was thinking a $100,000 cap per victim, and that there'd be a $50,000 deductible, so the person or the dealer would have some skin in the game, some reason to engage in safer behavior.
Representative Dunnigan, we have to move on. We have time for 2 more questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Senator Murdoch.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To the industry expert, the gentleman there, I think, what has generally been the pushback? Because as I understand the legislation, it's not eradicating or pushing back the having of firearms. It's more of the safety and the liability and responsibility for those that may become affected by. So is the industry receptive to that? Has it been okay with that aspect of it, the responsibility part, the accountability part?
Okay, so I'm an academic, but I'll speak at least.
Or maybe it's the gentleman beside you, somebody.
I wouldn't really speak for the industry. I think the industry, what I've seen is the industry really hasn't engaged very much on the mandate so long as it falls on the gun owner. In New Jersey, they are looking at potentially making it mandatory to provide, so New Jersey's law appears to cover intentional acts. It's not clear, but it appears to. And there is now a push to amend the bill that they just passed to require insurers, particularly homeowners insurers, to provide that coverage that the industry would push back against, in particular that this would become a burden now on the availability and affordability of homeowners insurance if you're forcing insurers to provide a coverage they don't want to provide and honestly don't believe they can provide.
Okay, and lastly, to the legislature, where is this piece of legislation in your assembly now? Where is it in the process?
In California, it's in the process where you introduce it, and then it hasn't gone through any committees yet. It hasn't gone very far because we're just at the beginning of our legislative calendar.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Mayfield?
Thank you so much. I just want to state that Illinois has a very good victims compensation program that's administered through our Attorney General's office. If anybody was really interested in how that program would work, you can definitely go online and just pull that right up. But I think this right here would be great NCOIL model legislation that we maybe want to have a committee on and just really delve into this further. I see this as a revenue generator for insurance companies and a way to basically, receive extra money without having to pay out any claims. There's just so many benefits here. When we talk about mental health, you'll have the ability, just like on life insurance, you ask, all of the, conditions that an individual has. You can ask, does somebody have a mental health issue? And then you can upcharge based on that. You can ask what type of weapons this individual has. How many weapons? Do you have high magazine cartridges? Do you have military assault weapons? And upcharge based upon the type of weapons. I see this as a win-win for the insurance industry. So thank you.
Thank you. Representative Tedford?
So it seems that the driver behind mandating insurance is frustration at the breakdowns in the screening process of getting a gun. But wouldn't the insurers be relying on the same tools for the screening that currently whoever's doing the background checks are relying on?
I mean, right now, homeowners insurance, although maybe it nominally covers this, it's not being implemented in a way that is in any way visible. So it's no questions are being asked. It excludes people who live in the home and family members, which makes it so that there are just no questions that are equivalent to the dog breeds or the pools or the trampolines or high capacity, all these different questions. So it seems like there have to be changes in what a homeowner's insurance policy would require in order for it to actually work.
I was speaking more to the actual gun insurance, that if you're trying to buy, there was a statement that the insurance carriers would do the background checks and the screenings, and that would go into the rates that you would charge. But aren't the insurers, wouldn't they be using the same tools that are currently being used? How is it going to improve the screening process of pushing it to insurers?
Yes, they would be using the same tools, but right now it's being done by overworked law enforcement officers, and I think we're asking our police officers to do too much already. And they don't have the capacity to do the kind of risk assessment that insurance companies do, and they have no skin in the game, because if they're wrong, like they were in Highland Park, nothing happens. If they're wrong, like that whole chart, and I could give you like 10 charts like that, nothing happens. So I want to know if there's an insurance person in the room who, if they knew, and they're looking at it, and this is public record that was known to law enforcement, if they knew that this guy had attempted suicide and the police were called, that he had threatened to kill everyone, that they took 18 knives out of the house, that there was a clear and present danger report. Again, these are public reports, and that in that report it said that the shooter admitted to having a history of drug use, being depressed when the statements were made. Would you insure that risk? Would a dealer? And that's the question, because no one is really taking the publicly available information, the police reports, the other, and making sense of it and saying, I have skin in the game. I don't think someone who attempted suicide, threatened to kill his family, they had 18 knives, and said, I'm depressed and using drugs, and that's why I made the statement, I'm going to kill everyone. I don't think the insurance companies would allow that person to get through a background check.
If I could just add briefly, I'll remind you of another core tenet that I tried to lay out for folks. The insurance industry doesn't ask the questions now because there are very few claims that are being paid. To the extent that any proposal didn't change that you're only looking at this fractional percentage, it strikes me as a blunt instrument to suggest that they have an enforcement requirement now around something that doesn't impact the risk. So again, keeping the absolute significant concern around gun violence to the side for a moment, the reality is the pricing mechanism, I'll put my actuarial hat on again, the pricing mechanism will react to the risk. And the reason that homeowners policy underwriting doesn't ask questions about that is because there are simply not significant claims being paid. And so that's an important, just general concept to remember as you consider this.
And to add to that, the individual who commits the crime is liable, right? You can sue that person. It's just that no one will insure them for the thing that they're liable for. No, if they're doing it on purpose, that is not an insurable risk. And so those are the incentives. If you are a gun owner who is going to commit an assault, going to commit a homicide, theoretically you could be disincentivized from doing that because of not only the criminal liability, but the civil liability that you would face from injuring another person, from causing a tort. They're not obviously disincentivized if they continue to do it, but that doesn't change the calculus from the insurer's perspective, which is they don't want to underwrite those risks. They have no interest in underwriting anything like that. There is no guarantee that there is data that could actually determine who falls into what category. There's some obvious risk categories for people who are criminally inclined, but that's not what they're insuring. They're insuring accidents. We didn't even have risk-based coverage in auto insurance until about the 1960s, right?
Yes.
Mercury General in the 1960s introduced that concept. Before that, we had pools. We had underwriting criteria. Benjamin Franklin's insurance company wouldn't write homes that had trees because those were more likely to burn up. So underwriting criteria have been around a long time, but we take for granted that for any given risk, insurers automatically have the data and know how to use it. That's not true. In this case, it hasn't been.
We have time for one more question, and I thank everybody for your patience on this. Obviously, this is a conversation we need to move forward. But Representative Stone, you have the last question. Thank you very much. Well, we'd like to thank our panelists. This has been a very informed discussion. I'd like to move this forward to our executive committee and everyone. Seeing no further questions, this general session is adjourned.